Houston Texans and the Baltimore Ravens. This is 4:30 Eastern on Saturday. As we sit right now, 9.5 across the board in favor of the home team Ravens. 43.5 is your total. So, Adam, there was the hope from Ravens fans that Mark Andrews was going to make it back this week. We get word a little bit before we start recording here on a Friday that he is not going to be activated, that he is not quite ready, possibly for next week should they advance. So that would be a big boost for them, but he's not going to be back out there for them. As I mentioned, Ravens rested all of their starters in week 18, so it's been a full 2 weeks since these guys have taken the field. We know what we saw in the Texans last week. Not really a weather game here, but just of note, cold. There will be some wind, and it could affect like super downfield stuff, but it's not anything that's going to be kind of affecting on things on a down-to-down basis. 9.5, 43.5. What do you see here?
What I see, Matt, is a game that gives off a lot of similarities to the other game involving a 1 seed, where you have a young quarterback with an ascendant offense, and you have to try to figure out in your handicap, how much do you believe in what you've seen from this somewhat unproven offense against a number 1 seed that has the opportunity to rest all of its players and has been sitting and waiting? And do you buy into the narrative about rest being good, or do you buy into the narrative about rust being bad? So for me, when it comes to Houston, this injury report did not break particularly well for the Houston Texans. And for me, it is Texans or pass. And I think the way the injury report breaks based on the defense, for me, it's ultimately going to be a pass, because where I would look to this game is to say, I think that Houston offensively, with the way CJ Stroud has been playing, can keep this game within 9.5. But the leak for me within that is that they got to have the ball to be able to do it. And if this defense for the Texans, especially at the defensive line and linebacker level, is as beaten up as it is, I think there's a pretty possible game script for the Baltimore Ravens to be able to run this ball a lot and be able to keep the ball for large swaths of time during this game. So I know you guys have probably a lot more in-depth thoughts. I'll turn the floor over to you if either of you have stronger conviction on a side or a total than I do.
Yeah, on that injury report, it actually turned out pretty much best case scenario for the Texans. Only one guy ruled out, one guy listed as questionable, and everybody else ended up not with any sort of injury designation for the week. So all that linebacking core, all of those guys ended up, despite the fact being limited in a couple practices all week, weren't even given any sort of game status for all of this. Leads me to believe that this, giving those guys some rest, was the reason for the limited practices for them. But the only guy ruled out, Jerry Hughes, defensive end, is not going to play for the Texans. Andrew Beck is a fullback, is listed as questionable for them. George Fant listed as questionable, but it was an illness for him, wasn't actually an injury for him, listed as questionable. And those are the only 3 players on the Texans side that have any sort of injury designation. On the Ravens side of things, we did get word Marlon Humphrey will be out for them in that secondary. So if you find that to be any sort of anything that moves the line for you, and as we mentioned, Mark Andrews not going to make it back for this week. Steven, what do you see here? Ravens and Texans, side, total, props, anything like that?
I want to preface everything I say on this week's pod with the amount of confidence I had for wildcard weekend is not there for me this week. I think it's really tight this week. There are some things I shared in the lines.com Discord earlier in the week that just aren't there anymore. It's not even worth mentioning because it's not going to help anybody. So I just want to at least preface everything I'm going to say on this week's pod with my confidence level is not very high this week. But at least for this matchup, a couple interesting things I see. Number one, all the talk about the Ravens changing their offense this season, going to Todd Monken at OC, all well and good, more well-rounded, certainly had some explosive games this year against respectable opponents, but the way in which they're running their offense, at least in terms of run versus pass, hasn't changed all that much. This is still the number 1 most run-heavy team by play percentage this season. And that is a bad matchup against this defense for the Texans, who ranks number 1 in the NFL in rushing defense success rate. So I do think Lamar Jackson's going to have to, carry the load here more so than maybe Baltimore would like in any given week in this matchup. Matt, I agree with you. The weather and the wind doesn't concern me at this point as much as it did earlier in the week. It's getting not to be as severe as some of the games we saw last week. So not too much of a downgrade there. On the other side, CJ Stroud, yes, he just obliterated the number one EPA defense in the league this year in the Cleveland Browns. And Baltimore's number 2. But I think they do it in very different ways. I have grown to have a ton of respect for Mike McDonald, the Ravens defensive coordinator. I think he's one of the handful of coaches in the NFL that will game plan week to week, will change how much man and zone coverage that he plays week to week, more so than most of the defenses in the NFL. A lot of times in the NFL, the defenses, what you see is what you get. Like, for just one of many examples, the Colts play a ton of zone defense. They don't change that any week. It's always the same. The Ravens change all the time. It's almost Belichickian in the way McDonald does that. He game plans for the opponent. So I think that is going to make it a lot tougher for CJ Stroud in this matchup against a defense that led the NFL in sacks this season. So I've just talked about a lot of defense there. That's why I bet under 44 in this game. That's why I think I would still bet under 43.5 in this game. 43 would definitely be a stopping point, with it kind of being a key number in terms of totals.
Yeah. So let's look here. I agree. Baltimore's defense is very, very good. Let's just play devil's advocate here. I'm not trying to make a position here. Let's just discuss the game overall, right? So, Adam, agreed. Baltimore's defense is very, very good, but we also know that the Browns defense was very good. I get it that the Texans were at home and this is on the road and it was indoors and this is outdoors and all of that. But this was a top 5 pass defense in the NFL, and CJ Stroud and company came in and just shredded them. I mean, absolutely nuked them through the air. I'm not saying that they can repeat that for sure against Baltimore, but we didn't think it was going to happen against the Browns. So why are we just writing it off that it's a certainty that Houston can't repeat at least some form of what we saw last week against Baltimore?
That's what I was saying about what do you believe about these offenses and about these young quarterbacks, because it's going to be a similar handicap when it comes down to Jordan Love and the Packers against the 49ers defense. You're going to end up asking a lot of the same questions. And so it brings us to a philosophical thing. And this is something for me that has been the case that I'd say for at least 3-4 years for me, is that I've moved away from betting on defense. It's just not repeatable week after week the way that offense is. And so if you were big on Cleveland, okay, well, you saw what happened. If you were big on a Dallas defense that by a lot of metrics, because of some of the huge performances they had, was great, well, you saw what happened to them last week. And so could you blame some of it on injury? We said Denzel Ward wasn't full speed for the Browns last week, but it was a lot more than that when it came down to how Houston played. And I just want to get to something philosophical about what Matt said, because he kind of went 180 on me with the Houston Texans defense and how the report broke. Just because they didn't end up with designations that could keep them out of the game does not mean that those guys are not injured and potentially not at full speed. And so that for me is just a philosophical thing. Matt can look at it and say, hey, this is as good as it gets because these guys didn't end up with designations. I can look at it and say, yeah, the question marks for me in terms of guys who are hampered in some way are in the wrong spots for me against the Ravens. But I certainly understand where Matt's coming from.
Yeah, Steve. So if we take a look, the Houston defense over the course of the entire season was very good against the run. We know that Baltimore leans on the run fairly heavily, though they did balance it out a little bit more over the course of the season this year with Lamar and throwing the ball and things like that. But so let's just say in a hypothetical world that this Houston defense really does step up here and makes it very difficult for Baltimore to run. If Baltimore has to become, and let's not say one-dimensional, but certainly shift offensive focus philosophy of instead of being really balanced, being more pass-heavy than they would like to be, does that at all change your thoughts or your handicap on how this game might go? Does it make the Houston side seem more interesting to you because of that? Or do you think that Lamar has proven, and let's be fair, he's going to win the MVP. He was very efficient this year with whatever they asked him to do. Do you think Lamar has matured enough as a quarterback to where even if he does have to throw more than what they would like to in the game plan entering this game, that you would still feel comfortable in them being able to win the game by double digits?
I'm not running to the window to lay 9.5 with the Ravens regardless here. Cause to use what Mo Noir likes to say, I don't have the coach's cell phone and don't know if they're going to abandon the run as much as I would hope they would in this matchup. But I do like the matchup when they are passing the ball, Matt, to at least halfway answer your question. The Texans have been a bottom half of the league pass defense by the advanced metrics for most of the season. And Lamar Jackson has proven that he can throw the ball when asked. I mean, against Miami, he had 15 yards per attempt and 5 touchdowns. Against San Francisco, he had 7 yards per attempt and 2 touchdowns, which was, pretty good against that defense. So he's had plenty of big games down the stretch to show that he can take care of the ball, not give it away like we've seen in previous postseason renditions. And, this is probably the best chance Lamar Jackson has ever had to win a playoff game, right? Like, he's been favored before, but not quite like this with this much support around him. So if I thought that they were going to, be a lot more pass heavy than they have been for most of the season, then yeah, I would probably lean Ravens here, but I don't know that for sure.
I'll tell you guys, one angle that I was looking at, and certainly want to get your thoughts here on this one. We know that it's playoff time. People are going to do whatever it takes to get it done, right? CJ Stroud's rushing prop is sitting at 8.5 yards. And if you look at this, and if we believe that you're going to get a defense in this Ravens squad that look, they play a lot. They play a lot of zone. They play, and I know that typically rushing quarterbacks, you want them to play man because they have their backs turned. But also, if you're CJ Stroud, who's been very good with the ball this year, for a rookie quarterback, as far as like putting the ball in danger, yeah, there's a couple of games you can look at where there was a bunch of turnover-worthy plays, but by and large, he has not thrown the ball into really terrible spots for the vast majority of the season. I can see where he looks and like, man, everybody's covered and stuff, like taking the 3 yards here, taking the 2 yards here. Like, I don't know if you get this done on one rush with CJ Stroud, although it certainly could be. We've seen, we saw Baker Mayfield on a broken ankle and broken ribs last week run for an 11-yard scramble, but could it get done on one? Sure. But I wonder if we can't get 4 just to hell with it, I'm going to take what they give me type runs out of CJ Stroud here and get us to 9 rushing yards. It just seems low to me in a playoff game where we know everything is going to be on the line. I kind of open the floor to either one of you if you would like to comment on that.
Well, I just don't know how much man or zone the Ravens are going to play any given week, right? So it's a low number. I'll give you that. And we do know that they are going to probably mix man and zone to some degree in this game. So there will be some man coverage opportunities for Stroud to run. We just don't know how much. That's just the nature of McDonald's defenses.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting for me. Adam, I know you usually talk a lot of totals and things like that. What is the game script for someone who wants to bet the over, and then what is the game script here for somebody who wants to bet the under? I'm assuming it's just Houston's offense works. Because if Houston's offense works, then you probably think that this total is way too low.
Well, I think if you are trying to figure out a total, you have to figure out, do you think Houston will have the ball? Because I believe if Houston has the ball, Houston's offense will work. And to add a layer to that, make sure you are not using the first game these teams played this year as any sort of guide. Yes. As for what will happen in this one. It was the very first game of the season, and CJ Stroud looked like a rookie in that first game of the season. He's not going to look nearly as much like a rookie in this one. To the point of what we're talking about here with the total in this game, I don't have a strong conviction. I really don't have a strong conviction on either side or total here. But to your point, Matt, the only way that I can make you a case toward over is that the Houston Texans offensive line holds up. And they have. Really, the second half of the season, especially once they got fully healthy, it's been a good offensive line. So I do believe that there's that case. And I would also factor in the Marlon Humphrey injury in the Ravens secondary is potentially big in terms of how they're going to match up with Nico Collins.
The only other thing I'll point out here, and then we'll move on, CJ Stroud's pass attempts line is currently set at 34.5. And really it depends on how you think the game is going to go. If you're all over the Ravens, I think you should also be all over CJ Stroud over pass attempts. And if you're more on the Texan side of things, then you should be leaning pretty heavily towards the under with all of it. But if we look at the over, if they're going to be trailing in this game, the attempt stuff from Stroud's going to be pretty good, because not only will they have to abandon the run and throw a ton, but like they're pretty efficient passing the ball, right? So we're not going to get a lot of 3 and outs, specifically in soft coverage. Stroud's been very accurate this year. They know how to kind of move the ball and chip the ball down the field between those big splash plays that we've seen in Nico Collins as well. So I think an over on that, if you're pretty heavy on the Ravens side of things, like there can easily be 2 fourth quarter drives in which there's 8 pass attempts from Stroud a piece. Like you could get 16 just on 2 drives of them just taking the little 4-yard balls as they matriculate the ball down the field and things like that. So something to also consider.
I got one more prop, Matt.
Yep.
One more quick prop. Now that we know that Mark Andrews isn't going to play, I thought Zay Flowers' receiving prop was maybe a tad low. 47.5 is available out there. Since their bye week in week 13, he's had 60-plus receiving yards in 3 of those 4 games, and he's had 10-plus targets in 2 of them. One of the games where he only had 3 targets, well, he had a 75-yard touchdown, so he still got over that prop number there as well. I just think he is clearly the number 1 target for Lamar since Mark Andrews has been out, and I think a number under 50 is probably a little too low on him. And my final thought on this game is I do wonder how much it matters that Mike McDonald, the defensive coordinator again for the Ravens, was successful against Kyle Shanahan in that Niners game, was successful against the Shanahan disciple and Mike McDaniel in the Dolphins game, and now faces another one from that coaching tree with Bobby Slowick, the Texans offensive coordinator who came from San Francisco as well. I just wonder about that. I don't know the answer for sure, obviously, but it's at least an interesting angle for me.
I ultimately ended up taking the Ravens down to 2.5. And no, I didn't do a 7-point teaser. If anyone's wondering, so this is kind of new to me. I know rest of country, you guys have been able to do this for a while, but basically I'm just kind of like making my own teaser essentially. So I took the Ravens down to 2.5 and then I pulled the Chiefs up later and we'll talk about that, but I didn't take the full 6 points. So basically I just took like 2 I parlayed 2 alt lines and ended up with a number that was cheaper than doing a traditional teaser anyway, right? And so I was able to get the Chiefs on the other side of 7 and get the Ravens on the underside of 3, and it still was only minus 120, which is cheaper than a lot of the stuff that you
minus 120. Are you serious? Most books won't even deal you a straight teaser minus 120 right now.
Yeah. So I got
Ravens
at 2.5, and then the Chiefs up to 7.5. So I only took 5 points with the Chiefs, and then I took the full 7 with the Ravens to take that down to 2.5. So anyway, that's how I played that one, if anybody was wondering.